Hello. For today's card, I'm using Altenew's bold alphabet dies and HoneyBee Stamps Coffee Break stamp set. Since the stamp set doesn't have any sentiments, I'm using those alphabet dies to create a custom one spelling out the word thanks. And I love how large these letters are, and the word thanks fits perfectly on an A2 sized card panel. So once I die cut these out, I realized I wanted to add some distressing to the words to create an ombre effect. So I'm going to use that negative piece that I had cut the words out on, add a little washi tape on the back, and I'm putting back the letters in. So I'm doing that because I want to add distress ink evenly on the top half of the letters. And specifically for this, I'm using a mix of gathered twigs and walnut stain. And as you can see later, just adding the touch of distress inks helps to add dimension to the letters so it doesn't look so flat and it really pops out. And the colors on craft really work well because it does create that ombre look. Since the letters take about half of the card, I'm going to use two of the larger coffee images for the other half of the card. So I'm placing the letters where I think I want them to be, and I'm grabbing the Frappuccino and the coffee cup stamp and placing it on the card where I want it using my MISTI so I can stamp this perfectly where I wanted it to be placed on the card. So I'm double stamping this just so I get a darker image. Once I have these two coffee cups stamped out, I'm kind of trying to figure out like where I want everything to look and how I want it to look. But also I decided that I wanted to create these stamps to be a shaker. So since the images are rather large, I'm using an X-Acto knife to cut out the open spaces where I want them to have little shaker parts. Once I finish cutting out the interior of the coffee cups, I'm using a Memento Tuxedo black ink marker to color up the edges so there's no white spaces peeking through. And for the Frappuccino, I just cut out that little circle that's going to be on it and we'll glue it onto the acetate later. For the coloring, I'm using a mix of Spectrum Noir markers and Copic markers, and I'll have everything listed down below in the description bar and also on the blog. But since there's not much to color, the coloring's really simple and real quick. I don't do anything particularly special to it, and I kind of keep it in a Starbucks kind of color scheme, and I think everyone drinks Starbucks, so it's super relatable. So once I finish the coloring for these two coffee stamps, I grab a piece of acetate and I'll trim it down so it fits perfectly behind those two coffee cups. And once I have that ready, I'll just use score tape to tape it down around the edges. And I just want to make sure that the acetate will be firmly on the back of this card. I use that Teflon bone folder just to push down the tape to make sure everything's secure. So now I'm placing the letters onto the card where I want it to be. And I just didn't want it to say thanks. I actually wanted to use the pun that's pretty common within the coffee cards, and I wanted it to say thanks a latte. But of course, I didn't have a stamp that perfectly fit this, so I just go ahead and pencil it in. And my first go around didn't work out because I thought it was like weirdly centered. So I go back and I fix that. And I'm kind of OCD here, so I want all the letters to be like perfectly the same size. So I'll just carefully write in the letters this time. But once I'm happy with how it looks, I grab my Copic multi-liner pen and I'll carefully outline the letters. And sometimes when you don't have the perfect sentiment or the perfect words or letters to build a sentiment that you want, you can always write it in. And for me, sometimes I really hate my handwriting, but in this case, I had to use it because I just didn't have a stamp set that said a latte, and I didn't want it just to say thanks. So once I finished that, I placed the letters just to make sure that everything is even, and I'll actually go ahead and glue this down. I'm using Tombow Mono Multi Glue to do this, and it's something that works very well and it dries pretty quickly. But if you want to move them around a little once you place it down, you're able to since it's a liquid adhesive. And I'm thankful for that because I think I messed up around the end, and I was able to fix it just because the glue hadn't set yet. So I'm also taking that little piece from the Frappuccino and gluing it on the acetate. And once I'm done, I'll erase all my pencil marks. Once I finish adding the letters to the card, I decided that I wanted to add some distress ink on the edges, and I picked Mauve Lawn because it kind of matched the Starbucks theme. The green looks almost like the Copic markers I use, so I think it really ties in together. I had smeared some of the writing, so I just used a white Jelly Roll pen to cover it up. So for the back of the card, I'm placing foam everywhere, and I always try to use about 2 layers of foam so that the shaker bits inside can move freely. And I want to add foam to as much of the back as possible just so that the card is even and there's not parts that you can push down because there's no foam behind it. And around the coffee cups, it's a little bit harder, but I'll just trim down pieces so they fit. And once I do that, I'm going to go ahead and add a second layer of foam. For the shaker bits, I'm choosing a bunch of random items. I believe I'm using some green sequins and some iridescent sequins and some gold stars. I use an anti-static powder tool around the edges of the foam around where I'm placing the shaker bits, just so I can make sure they don't stick to the sides when I close this up. So once I add all the bits that I want to use, I make sure that none of it's on the foam and everything's a little staticky when I create shaker cards, so it kind of moves, but try my best to contain them. I'll release all the release paper on the foam and I'll add my card base directly to the card, and the card is complete. This shaker is a custom one since there's no dies to easily do this, but since the image is so large, it wasn't hard to make it into one. I hope this gives you an idea to create a shaker using stamp sets you didn't think you could make into shakers. So I'll see you guys next week for another video. Thanks for stopping by.